pray for him. It's an honor to have you here today. If you were to ask me an image of what the church is, I would tell you that I think it's a field hospital. It's a place of safety and love where wounded people can come and be loved, be bound up, be encouraged, be supported, where people can find hope and love, where we can be equipped to care for ourselves and where we can be equipped to care for one another. A place from which we can go with our perspectives, our wisdom, our new insights, and be people who love and bring healing to our world. Therefore, the mission of care in the church is its most urgent mission. And what I hope that everyone here can do and feel today is the urgency of the mission of care. The urgency. And that we can all see this as a part of our mission as we try to build up our church, to develop the capacity to care for people in their most vulnerable moments of their lives. According to the World Health Organization, close to 800,000 people die due to suicide every year, which means one person every 40 seconds. Suicide, of course, is a global phenomenon, and it can happen at any point during a person's life. And there are indications that for each person who commits suicide, there may be more than 20 others who attempt taking their life. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, there's a report called the Leading Causes of Death report. It's quite a name for a report. It suggests that suicide is one of the leading causes of death overall in the United States. And suicide is the second leading cause of death among individuals between the ages of 10 and 34. No one knows these statistics better than Dr. Christine Moutier, who is the Chief Medical Officer at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. Dr. Moutier earned her medical degree and training in psychiatry at the University of California in San Diego, and has been a practicing psychiatrist, professor and dean at the UCSD School of Medicine, and the medical director for the inpatient psychiatric unit at the VA hospital in La Jolla. She's been active in countless clinical efforts with diverse patient populations, such again as veterans, Asian refugees, as well as physicians and leaders. She's testified before Congress, spoken at the White House, and has appeared as an expert in the New York Times, Washington Post, The Economist, BBC, and on. She's an active member of the National Academy of Medicine, Action Collaborative of Clinical Wellbeing and Resilience. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Moutier to Christ Church. Dr. Moutier, you know how much we appreciate you being here today. And as I've shared with you, we're on a journey. We have, the church has always been about the work of care. And yet we've come to know over the years more and more suicides in our community. Our efforts started with trying to offer simple pastoral care through church work and through associated organizations for helping people manage their grief and their suffering. And there came a moment when we realized that we needed to do more. And that's when we brought on board a psychologist who continues to this day to offer free medical care. We've had to add a second one now. And before long, we'll need to add a third. But what we're trying to do is to build our capacity to do work at a triage level. We don't wish to become a counseling center. There are lots of counseling centers here, but we have thousands of people for whom this is a safe place to come. And what I'd like to ask you about is this challenge I think that we all face, which are the barriers of resistance, that you call them, that keep people from raising their hand, right? In this community, very, very difficult to talk about mental health. Very, very difficult to talk about the normal reality of stress and anxiety when you're a professional that manages people, manages money, manages patients. It could be that South Charlotte is one of the most difficult places to raise your hand and get help. I wonder if you could speak to the stigma of mental illness and some of the barriers that people have to getting help.
Thanks, Chip. And it's an incredible honor to be here with this vibrant church community where being able to live your authentic lives and be vulnerable with one another is the way that community happens. It's the way that we can best be known and thrive and progress in our faith, our personal and our professional journeys. So I can tell that it is quite special here that we're having this conversation, and that after suicides were occurring, that they weren't just brushed under the rug, but that this is a journey that you're on. I look at our mental health and our spiritual health, our physical health, as being very integrated. I was a believer first, and then medically trained, and then became a psychiatrist, and then focused on suicide prevention. So in my mindset, all of what might seem like disparate viewpoints, based on theology, based on medicine and psychiatry, they might seem like they are coming from different angles, and they are. But if you hang it all in one framework that happens to be consistent with my own journey, and we all have a journey that we're looking at our life experiences through a lens of, they're very much integrated. And so we all have a physical being that we live in. That includes the brain. The brain is an organ in the body like every other organ. It is, there's genetic loading that has to do with how our various physical organs function, and there's the environment, and there's early experiences, there's trauma, there's nurturing, and all of that manifests in our day-to-day experiences with how we're doing in life. And so, to me, this is very holistic. We all have mental health, just like we all have physical and spiritual health. It's a question of how much we're paying attention to it, and if we're on a journey to learn how to cultivate kind of self-care and the support of others. And it is the case that stigma has been so pervasive around mental health, and my viewpoint on that is that for millennia, there was no science to shed light on how we could understand debilitating depression, psychosis, suicidal crisis. And so in our human instincts, we want to understand. So we project our own level of understanding onto others' lives and others' behaviors, or even our own. And we've made many wrong assumptions about where those behaviors and where that kind of suffering comes from. I think the science is mature enough now that we can start applying it to our everyday lives. That's something I call mental health literacy. And we see changes in the culture of our nation happening tremendously around mental health in some very, very positive ways. Meaning, in our most recent Harris poll at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, 92% of American adults feel that their mental health is as or more important than their physical health. But the trouble is, I think, where we are as a society in our journey is that if we stop there, that will not be enough to help us to take action at the times in our life when we're actually needing to apply some different strategies for ourselves and for our loved ones and for a church community. So I think this is part of the progress that's happening, and I feel like churches, faith communities are extremely well poised to make a huge difference in these strides that are happening from the public health standpoint around mental health and suicide prevention. And it will take some education, it will take actions, so that we can have conversations within a church community that are informed and that allow people their best opportunity to heal and to grow, and it requires taking a risk on everyone's part, but certainly on the part of people who are suffering. I always think about the fact that there's cultural stigma in the environment, that belief system that a group of people have. And then there's also the fact that when you are the one coming into a period of distress, for whatever reason in your life, oftentimes there's a very just primal instinct that wants to hide that views it as a point of shame, embarrassment, or weakness, when in actuality, every human being goes through challenges. That is a ubiquitous fact of life, and we're spending far too much energy pretending and hiding that.
So say more about risk factors. You named a few. How many of the risk factors have to do with things like depression, substance abuse, trauma? And then what about people who perhaps have not had, we would say, sort of a life of hardship, but may go through a period where there's something that's happened to their life, something very significant, job loss, divorce, alienation, family estrangement. To what degree does that inform the suicidal ideation?
Mm-hmm. Well, we look at suicidal thoughts as actually different in a way than suicidal behavior and suicide death, because suicidal thoughts are actually so common amongst the general population that they are certainly a warning sign of significant distress that needs to be paid attention to. But they are the mind's attempt to problem solve. When you're going through a really difficult time and there's pain or desperation, the mind is thinking about all of the many ways to come through it. And so many human minds will at least pass through the idea of ending their life as one potential solution to the situation that they're in. But acting on those suicidal thoughts is something that is not as common, thankfully. And we don't want it to be commonplace. And so it's part of the trickiness about suicide prevention education and efforts, especially for youth, that we have to be so careful to normalize the suffering and normalize help seeking, leaning on peer support or treatment, but to never normalize acting on suicidal thoughts as something that a society ultimately, feels is an acceptable thing. So that there's a fine line, and sometimes you'll see in entertainment or even in news reporting a lot of getting mixed up around that. But so when it comes to risk and protective factors for suicide itself, we do know that mental health and mental health conditions are an almost necessary but insufficient risk factor. And that just means that many times after a person has attempted or died by suicide, psychological autopsy studies will show that in more than 9 out of 10 cases, there was a mental health condition at play going on in their life. Now, in our society, less than half of people with mental health conditions are in treatment or recognizing it or have received a diagnosis. So there's a big gap there towards suicide prevention. But because suicide is more complex than that, and things like certainly life stressors, but we have to be careful about the life stressor part. Everybody experiences stressors, and 99.9% of people are resilient and work through it. But we can look at a relationship breakup, a financial stress, a catastrophic life situation as a precipitating factor that only when it happens on a bed of other risk factors. And so again, mental health conditions, but family history, genetic loading, early childhood trauma, those are certainly all other known risk factors. And again, to think about protective factors, anything that enhances our sense of being connected to one another is a huge protective factor right there. And again, I think about the way that a church community can be that for one another. Anything that enhances coping and resilience and help seeking, and that's the part that when I think about one of the biggest barriers we have to suicide prevention today and in our society, the barriers are not only structural in terms of access to care, but they are also internalized in terms of what we allow ourselves to do. Even if we have the best insurance plan or resources, just taking that step to say, I'm human, I have mental health that requires attention, or maybe it's not even that it requires it, but like the elite athlete or the executive will not, turn down excellent coaching. A similar thing could be said for therapy for all of us, because again, the mind is where our decision making is coming from. And so why wouldn't we want to optimize that? Anxiety can get the best of any of us. So, the bottom line for suicide prevention is that it's a heterogeneous and complex pathway that happens for every individual and for every population. But it also means that there are enormous opportunities for prevention and intervention that we think of along a full continuum from upstream to midstream to the acute point of crisis. And that's why suicide prevention efforts are actually even considered, you could embed things into a school curriculum starting in kindergarten. And there are studies that show certain structures like that and interventions can reduce suicidal behavior much, much later in a person's life.
So I want to spend some time on that. Before we go there, before we go upstream, I want to sort of continue to kind of reflect on this phenomenon that suicide rates are going up. And I wonder what you attribute that to. I wonder if you could speak to, I want to go first to maybe a little unpacking of the COVID experience, sort of being on lockdown. And the New York Times, as we were talking about last night, has written an article where physician scientists are saying that COVID's fundamentally changed our personalities, the way that we act, the way that we think, the way that we relate to other people. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way that we're going to be forever. But say something about sort of the COVID experience and what's coming up for you.
Well, to start, we know that suicide rates in our nation have been on the rise since 1999. They went up by 36% between 99 and 2018. And then in 2019, we saw the first downturn. And believe it or not, in 2020, during the early part of the pandemic, there was yet a second downturn in the national rate. That doesn't mean that every demographic group saw that decrease in suicide rates. And I think we're not out of the woods when it comes to the mental health and suicide-related impacts of the pandemic. Many times, experiences, especially traumatic experiences or disruptive experiences, have a long tail of effect. So we'll continue to learn about that in the years, actually, probably to come. So when I think about the pandemic and suicide risk, I think about the ways that we know that these buckets of risk factors for any population of human beings there are known risk factors, like we were talking about: isolation, sense of hopelessness, desperation, mental health conditions or worsening in them, problems with access to care, social disconnection, economic disruptions. Those are all known buckets of risk factors, and almost all of them were pressed upon potentially by the pandemic. But we saw some things happen quite naturally at the beginning of the pandemic, and the reason that I was very vocal at the beginning of the pandemic and trying to work with media and other policymakers to not make these dire predictions in escalating suicide rates, because number one, that could actually be dangerous unto itself to make those kinds of predictions as if there's no hope or no source of potential resilience or connection. But it's also because we've seen through history that during other periods of pandemics, natural disasters, wartime, that for a brief period of time, suicide rates will oftentimes go down in the early phase or the early aftermath of these experiences. And we think that's because there is a very natural and very strong sense of survival and resilience in the human spirit, and that especially during a period of disaster or crisis, we hunker down. Our psychological girding kind of naturally shores up, and we want to survive, probably very unconsciously and consciously. And we also saw that community cohesion, even though we were in a period of what I called physical distancing, because it really shouldn't have been social distancing, but because the virus is spread physically, we needed to keep distant. But that didn't mean that socially and our relationships couldn't be shored up. And we saw these phenomenon, be interested to know what happened here, but in New York City, we saw this incredible, every evening at 7 p.m., people hanging out their windows and clapping for first responders and health professionals, and in a way just coming together and supporting one another. We've seen some counties put services into place that they had in place for any disenfranchised group of people or people who are marginalized or disabled in any way, phone services, points of connection to get referrals into social services or mental health services, who opened those services up for the whole community, and who drew upon not only county workers, but volunteers to staff those lines. So there was this natural kind of shoring up that happened. And then, of course, what happens is we go into a period of kind of fatigue, and which can also turn into a bit of cynicism, where we fall back into whatever baseline where we had been living in terms of our own individual risk and protective factors. And so it is worrisome. In 2021, we're seeing provisional CDC data that shows that suicide rates went up, unfortunately, by 4%. And again, what we had been seeing even in the 2019 and 2020 data, and actually going back some time, is that for communities of color, for any marginalized communities like LGBTQ or other populations, that the protective aspects that were going on within society were not necessarily being experienced universally, obviously.
Well, what's happening with our kids? I mean, the leading cause of death between the ages of 10 and 34, the leading cause, what's happening with our kids?
Yeah, it is true that we're in a period of really emergency level public health crisis around youth mental health, called out by our Surgeon General some months ago. And that includes suicide risk. And, when it comes to any population, it's obviously going to be a complicated story, but if you think about the things that many youth are exposed to, the culture that they're growing up in, right during a period of time when, we all care about what each other thinks of us, but at that stage of development, peer-to-peer experiences are enormous. It's a part of the normal psychological developmental task for youth, is to come into their own sense of identity. And so even that separating from the family of origin psychologically for a period of time that we know as sort of teenage rebellion, that is a normal, healthy process so that they can land in their fully mature adult space. So, I think about things like increases in access to lethal means in the home environment. That can look like the opioid crisis, that can look like the increase in firearms purchases that happened during the pandemic, and particularly first-time gun owners, the rate of that doubling during the first year of the pandemic. We think about the impact of screen time and social media on our youth, starting from probably toddlerhood all the way up through the teens, and it affects us as well. I think we all actually need to be much more intentional, myself included, about what we're exposing ourselves to. It shapes our brains, it shapes our thought life. And I also think about the parent generation, that is all of us. And if we are actually practicing what we preach in terms of how we're conducting our own lives towards our mental and, let's say, spiritual health and relationships, are we able to talk about that over the dinner table in a way that is modeling a sense that it's normal to struggle and it is strong to lean on each other and to seek professional help when you need it? Those are things that I'm not sure we've embedded really well into our kind of public education, and again, a way to put that into practice. So it is obviously very multifaceted with youth, but gosh, even just this culture that celebrates individual success and fame on the basis of sometimes, very vacuous things, there's a whole lot that is negative in terms of helping our youth to find their true selves and their identity being rooted in meaning and purpose and connection to others. It's almost counterculture to find a pathway towards that. And I think as a parent myself, we've had to really ground ourselves in some of these values and figure out what does that mean at different times in our children's development. And you have to go against the grain, because sometimes it's going to be choosing their mental health over what looks like success to others, whether it's academic or athletic achievements. There are other things that matter more.
That's a really important thing for us to hear in this culture of achievement and success, that there's something that matters more. This summer, one of the first places that I connected with you was at the Aspen Institute, and this past summer at the health portion of the Ideas Festival, I listened to teenagers talk about they were doing, believe it or not, peer-to-peer mental health support over Instagram. And I asked the question, why is it that it's so difficult for you to talk to your parents about mental health? And their response, the first part didn't surprise me as much. The second sort of raised an eyebrow, made me think about myself. The first comment was, if I share with my parents what's going on, then I become a problem. They get super anxious, and it's no longer safe. The second answer that I got was to something you said earlier. My parents are not modeling their own struggle with mental health, and that makes it even more unsafe, you see. So how do you have a conversation with your kids about mental health? I mean, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. What's an approach, right? And not that anyone is going to exactly work, right? And what is the amount of disclosure that a parent should share with their child?
So I think the approach can look like different things at different times. In the course of normal, everyday family life and conversations, it ideally would look like mental health being a topic like every other thing that we address in mundane ways, meaning, we're checking in on various aspects of physical health. If you've had an injury or if there's a health condition, you're checking in on those things. I think one thing that you mentioned about that panel and what those teens told you, is that when your child is going through something, and you know that because you know your children's behavior patterns, you also see what's happening in their life, and the stressors that they're going through. I think conducting yourself as you approach your child to try to learn more about how they're experiencing their situation is really critical, because if we overreact, and so the way that I would approach it at a very just tactical level is to try to ask an open-ended question of, how's it going with, and maybe the starting place is their whatever, situation is going on at school or in a peer group, and ask it in an open-ended way. And if they're not willing to talk, which a lot of kids aren't when you first open it up, don't take that as a forever rejection, but be ready. You can say something like, "It's fine if you don't want to talk about it right now, but I'm here for you for when you do." Or also important to know is that it doesn't matter it doesn't matter who your kid is talking to. If it's with a trusted someone, peer or adult, it doesn't have to be you. So that's another thing that you can put out there is, if this isn't comfortable to talk with me about, remember you have coach, teacher, pediatrician, youth pastor who would love to speak with you about it. But when they do start opening up, and again, be ready for it, because it'll be when you least expect it. It'll be when you're driving in the car, oftentimes when you're not looking at each other, eye-to-eye contact. But that parallel stance can be easier for many children and teens to start talking about, and it'll sound like they're talking about something really mundane, a circumstance, a situation at school, or that happened on the field. And that's your signal to tune in. And what it is in that moment is practicing active listening skills. Tell me more about that. How did that feel when that happened to you? Really just inviting them to share more of their internal experience of what's going on. And I think the more you can not jump in to fix it, but to sit with it and say, wow, that must be hard. I think at some point also explaining that there is no challenge that you will face in this lifetime that is too much for this family to handle or to get through together. You have to say that out loud, and that there's nothing that will ever happen to you or in your life that will cause you to lose my love and support. Our children need to hear that, and I know we say it, or we think we say it, but I think in the language that they're experiencing it, the signal needs to be, you can handle it, you're not freaking out, you're not overreacting, and they're not in trouble if they're experiencing a hardship. And these are skills that we do not learn how to do in life, let alone as parents. And it's also, in a way, counter-instinctual to our parenting instinct, which has been for so long, from the time they're really little, to kind of control things and jump in and fix things and make the plan happen. But when they become teenagers, it has to be less about that and more about listening to them and providing that space for that. And I think the last thing that's really important is we have been too slow to see behavior warning signs of mental health deterioration or suicide risk. I'll say it this way, we've been too quick to write them off to stress, and therefore to not take the next step in terms of exploring the possibility of a mental health evaluation or support. And, in my estimation, of course it matters to find the right person who's trustworthy and gonna have a really good experience around all of this, especially at a time of crisis or distress. It's all the more important. But we've kind of cut ourselves off from that potential of treatment, which can be a game changer for all of this, because we've been so rooted in the science of stress in a way. I think it was very much in the pop science culture of the 80s and 90s that we can write everything off to stress. And stress is super important, but it doesn't mean we do nothing if we're having chest pain. If you're having recurrent chest pain, you go get it checked out. Sure, it might be stress-induced, but again, the heart is a physical organ. The brain is a physical organ. There are things that can change the outcome if we are willing to open ourselves up for that.
So let's just imagine, and you've had this so many times, that there is that moment that a friend, a child, a spouse says, I just think it might be easier if I'm not here. So take me through the psychology of that thought as if it's logical. And what do you say to that person who is thinking, it just would be easier?
Well, when a person is thinking about suicide, first of all, the majority of the time, they're not telling anybody. So if they mention it or they hint at it, or even back up a little bit, if their tone of voice sounds hopeless, overwhelmed, like they feel trapped or like they feel like a burden to others, that's when you ask, are you having thoughts of ending your life? And if they are, and they tell you, you need to treat that. They've just taken a risk to divulge something very, very personal, and that feels scary. It feels like a risk for them to share it. So you thank them. You show that you are someone who is not freaking out, but you're staying right there with them. And understand, to your question about what is happening in that moment, that the suicidal mindset is especially the moment of acute crisis where they are more likely to act on suicidal thoughts. It's a very short-lived, minutes to hours long period of time where the brain goes into a period of temporary cognitive constriction, so that suicide becomes the potential. Remember, I talked about as a coping strategy, it might be something that you flip through in a number of things. Your brain is just searching for a way through a situation. But when it comes to acute suicidal crisis, there is a cognitive constriction that we can think of as a tunnel vision, where it gets honed in on and sort of fixated on. And so if you understand that it's not a sign of weakness, it's not that they've become suddenly selfish, it's that they are trying to cope with something very painful and very, very difficult, and out of a feeling of desperation, hope, and hopelessness, potentially, that's where their mind is. And understand that it is not set in stone. Again, the period is very short-lived. If they just simply live through it and don't have access to lethal means during that period of time, the brain opens back up into its usual, more flexible state of coping strategies. And we are highly influenceable. We are such social creatures that if you have somebody who simply is there with you and says, I'm going to stay here with you during this tough period you're going through, I'm here for you, that is huge. That can be the difference between them feeling that desperation and holding on for a period of time. And again, being somebody who potentially helps them to take that next step to talk to someone else, ideally a professional, but it could be a pastor, it could be a trusted, safe resource person in the church community. Those are potentially life-saving steps that happen. So that's one thing that I want everybody to know, that suicide prevention is all of our business. We all have a role to play, and you don't have to be a mental health professional. All you have to do is be a listening, caring friend or family member that's willing to be in that dark valley with them for a period of time, and be able to just be there with them.
One last question before I go upstream and talk about how we can kind of build resilience. What do you say to someone who did everything they could to love their family member, and their family member committed suicide. And they're feeling guilty that they didn't do enough, that they wish they had this, if they had only, you know that word, if I had only. What do you say to someone like that? I shared with you that my grandfather committed suicide, and no one told me. And I was at a party about 20 years ago in Columbia, South Carolina, and someone came up to me and said, "I'm so sorry how your grandfather died." And I'd always been told that he died of a broken neck, but I didn't realize that the reason his neck was broken is because he hung himself. And that was hidden from me. And I can only imagine what my mother and grandmother must have felt. What do you say to a family, that's living in the wake of that, and feeling guilt, feeling stigma, feeling like they just were a terrible family member?
Well, the experience of losing a loved one to suicide, like many forms of loss that can be quite complicated, it is a complex type of bereavement. It is completely normal to go back and think through all of the moments in time when you can say, what if this, could that have been a different fork in the road? Because suicide involves an act that appears to be volitional, we've vastly misunderstood it as the complex health outcome that it actually is. For millennia, we've misunderstood that. And I think what happens in our world, at the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, we have chapters across all 50 states and Puerto Rico. We have tens of thousands of people and families who are involved in suicide prevention because of their experience of loss. By the way, there's also lived experience, meaning those of us who've had our own suicidal crises who are engaged in the fight as well. And that's a sign of stigma reduction. But so I think becoming more knowledgeable about what drives suicide risk oftentimes is helpful for people who've experienced loss to understand that it's quite complex. It's not that there is an easy or an identifiable solution that could have made the difference. Although certainly from a prevention standpoint, we do understand that suicide can be preventable, but it doesn't mean it is preventable in every instance. And that is something that we try to balance in our suicide prevention work. But the other fact of it is that the healing after suicide loss is a journey, just like grief is in general. But we do it best when it's in community. And so suicide loss support groups, various ways of connecting, and also turning that grief and that tragedy into a sense of meaning and purpose is a tremendous point of healing for many, many loss survivors. But, I think we need to understand that we have to have compassion for each other. We don't know everything in every moment. Nobody does, not even the world's most, expert in any particular field or area. We don't have that kind of, omniscient knowledge. And so we are all doing the best we can with the knowledge that we have in moment by moment. And I think affording each other, and if you do know somebody who's lost a loved one to suicide, come to them just like you would another friend or person who's grieving a different type of loss. Don't stay away because you don't feel like you have the right language, or you're not sure what to say about the fact that it was suicide. You don't have to. Just show up in the usual way. So that's been another difference where stigma has shown up, is after suicide death, and your family's story is not unique in the sense of keeping it a secret, because how do you explain that? And with the stigma surrounding that, and in a way trying to protect our children and our family members. Oftentimes it makes it much more complicated for them, because oftentimes in families, children actually do figure it out, even if it's being kept a secret.
Absolutely. And I have to tell you that after going through the grief of that, and this was years before I got married, it's now an incredibly empowering conversation to say, let's talk about mental health, let's talk about, and to appreciate that this is, a part of our family history. So let's shift toward what a church can do, right? So I am utterly determined that we are doing, while we're doing great things, what we can do over the next 5 to 7 years could truly be extraordinary, right? So think with me about this for a minute, and I'm going to pitch something to you, and I want you to tell me what you think. Okay. So we have thousands of people in our community, and we all have taken these vows, haven't we? Will you do all in your power to uphold these two persons in their life in Christ? Where does that come from? Our baptismal vow. So if we really all kind of bought into that, and we all felt a certain responsibility to the care of others, just think what we could do here. And one of the things that we do as a church, this is singular in our mission and ministry, is to try to connect people to the love of God in Jesus Christ, to let them know that they are loved, to connect people through worship to the love of God, and in particular, through all of that, to do it in community. The power of being in community, friends, cannot be underestimated. This is what worries me about what we've learned during COVID, which is I can stream my spiritual life. That really concerns me. As if mental health and mental well-being is going to be boosted through a screen. Now, I think that it's certainly supplemental. But say something about what it means, first, just to be a part of a community. How does that contribute to mental health and well-being?
It's foundational. I mean, we are wired as social creatures, hardwired that way. And so the pandemic has had so many silver linings and so many tragedies. But, I think being able to stream and work remotely is a double-edged sword, right? Because we could carry on with our work, we can carry on with being together virtually, but it doesn't allow us to do it optimally. Or I should say there'd be challenges. You'd have to be really, really intentional about developing deep community relationships if it were virtual only. In the science around suicide risk and prevention, one of the most protective factors against suicide risk is a strong sense of interpersonal connectedness. Now, like you talked about in your TED Talk, you can be surrounded by people and feel utterly isolated and alone. So in part, it depends on the culture and how we're invited into relationships. I think the church plays this and can play this critical role in what I would view as the public health approach to preventing suicide, and certainly to advancing mental health well-being and resilience. It needs to have some intentionality around it, because just communing, if there are attitudes of judgment and misunderstanding, can actually be detrimental to some people who are struggling, or who, through aspects of their identity or other aspects of their life, feel a sense of alienation.
Mm-hmm. But if we can aspire to be a community that normalizes a conversation about mental health, that's sort of the journey that we've been on. But I guess I want to go a step further and ask you, what can a church do? And I think the big idea here is that as we began this work with just one therapist, people said, why would you need a therapist, right, at the church? And then all of a sudden, her schedule was completely booked, right? Because we were offering free care and we were removing the barrier, right? Because there was a time when you could call 704-333-0378 and potentially be seen same day, right? Now we've added a second person that's part-time. So when you think about what we can do, what would you say as we think about your word, a comprehensive strategy towards spiritual and mental health? What would you encourage us to think about? Because what I'm wondering about is, what if we were to build a center for well-being here where we could go upstream and help people think about prayer, spirituality, everyday practices of mental health and spirituality that can build a sense of resilience. If we can then contextualize it to explore not only mental health, but marriage and family issues, life transition issues, addiction and recovery. If we could, a host of other things that we could potentially deal with, aging, end of life, all sorts of things. Imagine a church that you could come to where you could walk in and there would be this center here. There could be assessments done confidentially, and where you could connect you, a family member, your child, to being in a conversation and education and learning and groups that together could boost the well-being, go upstream. Do you think that's possible?
It's absolutely possible, and you would be on the cutting edge of faith organizations in doing so. But I think it has become an idea that's out there now, the role of faith communities in preventing suicide. But so the public health framework for suicide prevention.
Can I pause you there?
Uh-huh.
Did you hear what you just said? We are in the business of public health. Did you hear that? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
And you don't have to turn into a clinical, you don't have to offer clinical services, actually. Yeah. You can keep your solid role as a community faith-based organization and contribute to a bunch of the layers of that comprehensive approach. First of all, through community and education. And I think that universal education approach will convene people in a way that allows the learning and sophistication to grow, but it also will help the peer-to-peer connections to grow quite naturally if you just start convening around these mental health or life transition types of topics. And then I think the next layer that's really important to think about with suicide prevention is, how do you reach people who are becoming at risk or who are vulnerable? And remember, vulnerability is not set in stone. It's something that's very dynamic in our lives. There are times when we are more vulnerable and more at risk than others, and it has nothing to do with our intelligence or professional success or other aspects of our identity. It has to do with being human. So that part that is a way for real-time connection and support and connecting and facilitating to treatment for those vulnerable times, that's the next layer of a comprehensive approach. Mm-hmm. And then the way we look at it from the public health vantage point is that a community that's doing suicide prevention well is connecting and therefore meeting as a coalition between the school system, workplaces, faith communities, the Department of Health, clinical systems. They're all having some connection, and at least knowing how each other system works so that there's some integration. We look at suicide prevention as a safety net where we try to shore up all of those gaps. And you think about the key people who have eyes on people and who have a role with people, and those are pastors, educators, first responders, workplace leaders, supervisors at work. So some specific education on mental health and suicide prevention for key roles is also part of that approach.
Yeah. So we could do the work of first education, which we've been doing, do the work of education, do the work and education is a kind of intervention, right? Mm-hmm. Because people learn something and they raise their hand. The next level, I think, as I'm trying to bring a correlation to what we're doing now would be therapists that now can, for those who raise their hand and need to go somewhere pretty quickly, we could build that base out. But again, keeping it, not turning into a clinic here.
Right.
And then, being able to see people for 8 to 10 times like we are now, and then building our partnerships for people and around specific issues that need the deeper care. How does that sound?
It sounds ideal, and I'm thinking about that the role of the mental health professionals, even though they are trained clinicians, in their church role, they're providing support and they're facilitating connection to the next step. And the next step could be outside the church. It could be, a psychiatrist, psychologist, group therapy, or it could be a peer group within the church. So I think there's a variety of ways that you could kind of really start to target some of those key areas that you might view as they're essential and they need to be strengthened in some way. And again, I think the peer-to-peer aspect, because mental health professionals are in short supply and access to care is hard, unfortunately, and that's a bigger build through advocacy and other things, the ability to rely on each other or on a trained peer who's been through it, that is a relatively untapped aspect to suicide prevention that we're really starting to explore what works, how do you build that army of peer support specialists for also, by the way, for clinical health systems, not just for community-based organizations like this.
Well, I'm hearing this as a big invitation today, as we're going to have to end our conversation, but we're going to continue it too. Would you be willing to continue to talk to us about this and help us think and dream about what we can be as a church?
Oh, it's really my pleasure. This is like, this is a treat and a dream come true, because remember, when people are suffering, mental health professionals are lower on the list. They're more likely to go to a peer, a pastor, maybe their primary care provider than a mental health professional. So you all are poised to do this.
Well, to everybody here, as I wind things up, could I ask you to pray about this? Yeah. I mean, how many people here would love to have a trusted resource where you could be educated, your children, grandchildren could be educated to address these issues that are in all of our hearts, to explore not only mental health, but marriage and family issues, how to talk to kids, to talk about life transitions, care, the whole spectrum of things that are on our hearts, depression, family estrangement. Imagine having a resource here like that we could go to ourselves, we could refer to others, and imagine if that kind of resource could be also outreach to people like teachers, firefighters, police officers. This is a big dream, right? And you can see I'm kind of passionate about it, can't you tell, right? Because I feel like when you know something, when you've been grabbed by the truth, and you know you're capable of doing something, you have to do it. It's sort of like obedience to God. How we do it, we have to be thoughtful and prayerful about. And we're doing a lot of thinking about that. So pray about that. We'll talk more about it. Let's say a prayer. For all persons who they themselves or within their families are living with mental and emotional crises right now, we pray that the joy and love of Christ can bring them comfort, that we can be a part of their comfort, their learning, and their recovery. For all who provide services for persons who live lives that are affected by mental illness, for social workers and counselors and mental health professionals and pastoral caregivers, fortify their hearts and give them strength to bear witness to your love. And for this church, that we might act with a spirit of courage and justice, not only for people in our church, but for people in our community who need the necessary support services. Give us a big vision, O Lord. We pray to you, and we give you thanks for this hour and for all the work to come. Amen.
Amen.
Let us thank Christine Moutier for
Oh,
being here
thank
today.
you.